I'm delighted to see you, and we have a very wonderful presentation coming up soon. But I just want to say a word about the Wyant Lecture, which is really part of the endowed professorship established by Louise Doherty Wyant, class of '63, and her spouse, Jim Wyant. And they did it in honor of Sister Ann Cyril Delaney. And Sister Ann Cyril was a professor of English here for many years, and she was truly a remarkable person. The lecture series was, as I said, recognized the speakers in the humanities, history, and the arts. And this recognizes, I think, in so many ways, the intellectual breadth of the person for whom it is named, Sister Ann Cyril. So I especially welcome today Dr. Amy Boesky, author and professor of English at Boston College. Dr. Boesky directs BC's new minor in Medical Humanities, Health and Culture, and that's an interdisciplinary program. I know that her talk is going to be very thought-provoking and insightful, and I'm delighted to ask Dr. Leonard to do the introduction of Amy.
Thank you, Sister Janet. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Amy Boesky is a professor of English at Boston College, where she teaches literature and nonfiction writing and serves as the director of Medical Humanities, Health and Culture minor. Originally from Detroit, Dr. Boesky has worked and studied in Oxford, England, Washington, D.C., and the Boston area, where she has lived since 1992. She received her undergraduate degree from Harvard College and went on to earn a master's degree in Renaissance English from the University of Oxford. She received her PhD from Harvard University. While her recent writings are contemporary and more personal in nature, she has also written on Milton and utopias in early modern England. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including What We Have, a memoir about her family's experience with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. What We Have has been described as both touching and painful, and leaving the reader wanting more, as she is such a good storyteller. Recently, Dr. Boesky has edited a collection of personal essays on the subject titled The Story Within, Personal Essays on Genetics and Identity. One reviewer noted of this work, all personal narratives serve as a reminder that we are all individuals, the product of our genetics and the paths in life we have chosen. For those who have traveled in a similar path and who have faced genetic illnesses, these stories can be a source of comfort. These stories can also help inform and educate and generate much-needed dialogue about health and body norms. The narratives in the story within are a reminder that every life has value. Dr. Boesky is currently beginning a new project that will study the interconnections between genetics, narrative, and representation. She also writes creative nonfiction on issues related to family and the writing life. Tonight she will speak to us on narrative as change agent, writing, advocacy, and medical humanities. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished lecturer for the evening, Dr. Amy Boesky.
So, I'm going to be speaking with you a little bit this afternoon about narrative and narrative's relationship not only to change, but the ways in which narrative can help us to think about interdisciplinarity and its connection to health. So I'm actually beginning by thinking a little bit about the notion of relatedness. And there's a word that my students use at Boston College, maybe you don't use it here. Does anyone here use the word relatable? English professors complain when students use the word relatable. They say, what does that mean? But in fact, we know what it means, right? When it's something that we can relate to, something that we connect with, and we think that story resonates with me. And one of the things that's of interest to me is not only what kinds of things do we relate to, what are the ways in which narrative can help us to relate to things outside of ourselves, but how can we broaden that sphere? How can we find ways of relating to things outside of ourselves, things that maybe we knew nothing about, people's lives that were nothing like our own, and how can narrative help with that? So that's one of the things that's of interest to me. In terms of my own teaching, writing, and administrative work, these days I am more and more involved in relations with people very much outside of my own field, people who are working in economics and sociology, in bioethics and history, and who help me to think about the issues that I'm interested in from very different perspectives, often surprising me or asking questions that I hadn't thought of at all. So I want to talk with you guys a little bit about 3 different ways of thinking about relatedness. The first is, strictly speaking, relations. That is to say, my family story. Who are my relations? How did their story impact my story? How did, as we were just talking about in the last 20 minutes, how did an English professor come to be working in medical humanities? How did this happen? And a lot of it for me came from increasing immersion in the story of my own family, learning more about who these people were, what had happened to them, how their story impacted my story, and then the decision, which was not an easy one for me, to write about it and to make it part of my own professional and academic career, which had been very much grounded in 17th century British literature, safely far away from anything that had happened with any of the people in this photograph. So who are these people on this beach? This beach is somewhere outside of Chicago, circa 1915. And these people are my mother's relatives. And the ones, in some ways, the ones that matter most, or the ones who this story is mostly about, are the 2 girls who you can see here. The girl on the very left-hand side is my mother's mother, Sylvia. Here she is in this photograph laughing next to her sister, Cody. Cody was a nickname for Florence, which she couldn't pronounce. Her parents, Bee and Meyer, are the ones right behind her. We don't know who the other people are. They were family friends, the ones who were embracing that little girl. We don't know who they are. Their story's been lost to us. Meyer was an immigrant from probably the Russian-Polish border, who left during the pogroms as part of the second wave of immigration with his money in his sock. It was a very common story. He didn't know where he was going to go. He took a boat to Europe, and on the boat, he met someone. He was either going to go to South Africa, which is interesting, this is where my husband's from, or he was going to come to America, because there was a sense that you could make a life there. He met someone on the boat who knew someone, and he ended up in Chicago marrying Bee, who, according to my mother, was a kind of despot and a tyrant. She remembers her as a kind of larger-than-life woman. She certainly looks like that here in this photograph. Meyer brought more with him from the old country than just his sock full of money. He likely brought with him what we now know as the founder's mutation on the BRCA gene, the deletion in the BRCA gene that would eventually foreshorten the lives, not just of one of his daughters, but both of his daughters, and as it turned out, of their daughters as well. My mother's mother. And this is Sylvia here in this photograph. By the way, my mother was born in July. I think that she was only a few weeks old in this photograph, and you could see what she was dressed in, which might give you some sense of mothering and overprotectiveness. She had a million layers on. Sylvia, my mother's mother, fell madly in love with a boy who, in the family lore, was called a no-goodnik. That's not real Yiddish. It's invented. But you can guess what it means, right? He played sax in a band at a local country club, and he kept studying for the bar exam, which he took, and he failed, and he took, and he failed, and unfortunately he drank, and eventually he and Sylvia split up at a time when divorce was really stigmatized. My mother was born in 1934 in the part of Chicago that is now Lincoln Park. My mother was an only child, and that onlyness impacted her in multiple ways. Cody, like Sylvia, remember Cody was the other little girl in that photograph of the beach, also had just one child, also a girl, Gail. Because neither had siblings, and because they lived near each other, they really grew up more as sisters than as cousins. My mother and Sylvia lived together, as my mother remembered it, as much like roommates or friends as like mother and daughter. Especially after Jerry had moved out, it was just the 2 of them. Sylvia had a little inheritance money left over from Meyer, and after Jerry moved out, they survived on that money along with the small jobs Sylvia took from time to keep them going. In my mother's memory, Sylvia loved dancing and silk stockings, and the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay. This is the last photograph that we have of my mother and her mother together. My mother, much to Sylvia's shock and dismay, decided to go to University of Michigan. It's hard to imagine that from Chicago to Ann Arbor is about, I don't know, who else? Is anyone here from the Midwest?
2.5 hours.
Well, maybe 4.5 hours driving, but it's not very far, right? But Sylvia was devastated because it felt really far to her that my mother was defecting and leaving Illinois to go to Michigan. But during my mother's freshman year, my mother immersed herself in everything that freshmen immerse themselves in now, and they did then as well. But during my mother's freshman year, my mother got very sick. And by the spring, she had been operated on and diagnosed with, actually, they closed her up again. It was inoperable, late-stage ovarian cancer, and she was given only a few months to live. So my mother went home for the summer. My father was supposed to go, he was a medical student at Michigan. He was supposed to go to Europe for the summer. He moved to Chicago with my mother, and they took care of Sylvia that summer, but she died in September. When does an individual story, when does an individual moment in a life become part of a different story? For my mother, it happened both with the death of Sylvia and then, shockingly, 2 years later, with the death of Cody. Same illness, ovarian cancer, the same death, almost the same amount of time between diagnosis and death. Sylvia's death and Cody's reset the clock of my mother's life. It was the early 1950s. She took a semester off of college. She and my father got married in November. Against the odds, and this is kind of amazing to me, they moved into married student housing, and my mother not only finished her BA, I think that was in the early 50s, she not only finished her BA, but she was actually accepted into Michigan's PhD program in clinical psychology. But my father chose to get his military service out of the way, and they decided she would give up graduate school, and they moved to San Francisco, where he was based as an Army doctor. My mother was 23 when my older sister, Sarah, was born. The way my mother described it, having babies made her miss her mother less. This is my mother with me in May of 1959. And this is Sarah, Julie in the middle, and me. Anyone want to guess who chose those glasses for me? Yes, I did. I was allowed to start choosing my own glasses at that stage. Probably not a good decision. My sisters and I grew up knowing that ovarian cancer ran in our family, but we didn't really know what that meant. Our friends had big, extended families at events like Thanksgiving, but our family was tight, small. We drew in and hunkered down. In the stories my mother told, fate figured largely. She had different reasons, as she told us, for why Sylvia got sick. In one version, which she and my father sometimes shared, Sylvia had gotten cancer because she was depressed. She'd lost the will to live, is how my mother put it. Meyer's inheritance was almost used up. My mother felt part of the story, and not. Here she was in suburban Detroit, married to a psychoanalyst. She had 3 daughters. She was living a kind of normal suburban life. It didn't seem like she could be impacted by any of the things she was saying had been loomed so large for Sylvia. Eventually, she went back to school and got a master's in history, but the people she studied, Alexander the Great, the Tsars, were shadowy giants from another age. My father, meanwhile, cast his eye closer to the present. He registered my mother with researchers at medical schools. We're looking into hereditary cancer clusters. He tried to get my mother to consider a preventative hysterectomy, but she refused. Then, in the early 1980s, our story changed again. I was in England doing the first part of my graduate work when my mother's first cousin, Gail, Cody's daughter, woke up one morning with her abdomen filled with fluid. Stage 4 ovarian cancer. My mother flew into action. I was still in England when she had the preventative hysterectomy my father had lobbied for years. She was 49, Gail 47. The surgery was hard on my mother, but she recovered, and Gail did not. Gail died 2 years later in the same hospital and the same week that her first grandchild was born. In my 20s, I lived inside a new kind of relating. a narrative of risk and of susceptibility, but also a narrative of advised control. Marry, have babies young, my parents advised me. 35 was the age when I needed to have my ovaries removed, according to my doctors. And in some subliminal sense, throughout my 20s, this was how I lived. The story held me inside its exigencies. But how to make sense of that story inside of a story that kept changing? When I was 27, busy with grad school and dating and friends and my own life, my mother called to tell me, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite interpret, that she had found a lump in her breast. She'd seen the doctor, and it was cancer, she said, but tiny, curable. This was the new story, this instead of that. Yes, she had cancer, but it wasn't like Gail's cancer. She would have the lump removed and everything would be fine. Stick to our story. She seemed to be saying, don't let the digression deter you. Against all odds, somehow, I met the right person at the right time. Jacques and I got married a few months after my 31st birthday, and a year and a half later, we had our first daughter, Sasha. Only then, our story changed again. Sasha was almost a year old when we learned my mother's cancer had come back. My mother died less than a year later, in August 1, 1993. I was 7 weeks pregnant with Libby, my second daughter, who here in this picture is in the backpack standing up. By the way, trying to guess the vintage of people in this room. She's a senior in college now. Any seniors here? All right, you may have had the very same backpack that you may have been standing up in, just to make it relatable, as it were. That the two stories in our family were actually one and the same. What my mother had, what Sylvia and Cody had had, what Gail had, were all part of the same condition. HBOC, they told me in the letter, hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. A scientist named Mary Claire King had cloned the BRCA gene. In families like mine, a deletion on that gene essentially knocked out one of the two guardians that, for most of the population, helped to protect against cancerous changes in the breast, ovaries, and other organs. Though men have mutations in the BRCA gene as often as women, and can also develop cancers because of them, particularly of the prostate gland, women are most susceptible. Women with a deletion in the BRCA gene carry a risk as high as 80 to 90% of developing breast cancer over their lifetime, and 40 to 50% chance of developing ovarian cancer. For my sisters and I, these 5 girls, we did have a boy, one boy. Ben was born later after this. There's one boy out of the 6 in this next generation. For my sisters and I, this changed the way that we thought not only about the past and the present, but also the future. It meant for all of us decisions about preventative surgeries, not just our ovaries now, which we had planned for, but our breasts as well. For me, it also meant deciding to write and talk about this publicly or not. In 2010, after 5 years of working on this, usually in the mornings before I went to teach 17th century British literature, which was what I did, I published a memoir about our family story, what we have. And I think in many ways, this was a harder decision for me than the decision about surgeries, more complicated and carried more emotional and psychological freight. I had one of my colleagues stop me in the hallway and she said, "Don't you feel kind of naked having written about this?" And I thought, as I kind of slunk back into my office, well, I didn't until you just asked that, but actually now I kind of do. But I was glad that I had written about it, and that decision, in a way, put me into a different kind of relationship with my work, eventually with my colleagues and new colleagues, and to the kind of writing I did in the future. So I didn't plan on doing an edited collection about genetic mutations at all. I was on sabbatical, and I was increasingly curious, and curious is probably too mild a word for it, almost obsessed with wanting to know what it was like for other people who had genetic mutations of other kinds. Because I found myself wondering, in some way, did I have more in common with people, or did my sisters have more in common with people who are facing genetic mutations for, say, early onset Alzheimer's or Huntington's, or a host of other kinds of genetic and hereditary conditions, then perhaps we might with someone from a family who had breast cancer in her 60s or 70s, but no one else in her family ever had. Because what mattered in my family were the blurred lines, the thinking, well, there's 3 of us. I'm the middle sister, and my job is to protect my younger sister. What happens if I don't have the mutation and she does? I'm thinking about my daughters. These were the kinds of blurred lines. I'm thinking back about my mother and her mother. These were the blurred lines that were of great interest to me. So I really became interested in knowing what it was like for other people. And what I did was I began to reach out and ask other people what they had experienced and what they had gone through. And this collection ended up being a product of that asking. And for me, it ended up forming essentially a set of new relationships. We were 17 writers participating in this collection, and we all wrote very personal material. We were respectively daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, sisters, and we became, I think, extremely close. It was actually very interesting. We ended up meeting in a symposium. We all came together after the volume was published. And it was an extraordinary thing to meet these people because we had been emailing and writing and talking and sharing stories with each other and reading each other's work for almost 2 years. We felt as if we were almost connected. The questions that were of greatest interest to all of us really kind of came into or fell into 3 distinct areas. And I think they could be organized around the ideas of finding out. So kind of number 1, if you have a genetic mutation for something, would you want to know? We were talking about this a little bit this afternoon. Just because you can, whether it's Parkinson's or Huntington's, or it could be a condition that could lead to hereditary blindness. Would you want to know? So I'm just curious. Show of hands, if you will, because we don't have little clickers here. Do you think if you had something like this in your family, how many people think you would want to know? How does this change how you think of yourself in terms of your relations? How does it change how you see yourself? And in some instances, we had writers in this collection who only learned they had a genetic mutation when it showed up in their child. For example, Jennifer Rosner. She is up at the top holding the 2 girls. They have hereditary deafness, and she had no idea this ran in her family until her first daughter was born profoundly deaf, and she was still told by a geneticist that it wasn't genetic, and then her second daughter was born with genetic deafness. Claire Dunsford, also, her son has Fragile X syndrome. She also didn't know that she was a carrier for this until he was born, and moreover, she did not know, and she has only recently learned, that there are implications for so-called carriers. She originally believed that as a woman, she was a carrier and that her son would have significant symptoms from this, but that she wouldn't. Now the science has changed, and she and her sisters are discovering that there's a kind of rebound, and people of her generation and her father's generation are exhibiting symptoms in later age. So this is all kind of dynamic. Kelly Kupo, who is a student of mine whose family has Huntington's disease, and she's in her 20s. She's really struggling with this. She has 3 siblings. At the time of writing the essay in this volume, she did not think she wanted to know. Neither did Kate Priskenis, whose family has early onset Alzheimer's. She has actually been tested but has not gotten the results. She does not want to have children. She's tormented about whether or not she carries this mutation, but having watched her mother die of Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, which is very different from Alzheimer's, she does not want to know. So it was really interesting. In our tiny little sample pool, most of the people did not want to know. In terms of intervention, it's actually really interesting. I found that the greatest surprise for me was not only that there were so many differences among the writers, and that we all, though we had so much in common with each other and loved debating these issues, we all kept coming back to, well, it depends. And what about this? And we would really disagree with each other and think about things in really different ways. What surprised me also was the whole notion of intervention. I had thought about intervention in a fairly, I have to admit, I began thinking about it in a fairly simplistic way, the way I had thought about it, which is, look, I have BRC in my family, the mutation, I can have preventative mastectomies and oophorectomies, that's intervention. I hadn't thought about intervention in terms of writing or activism or teaching. So people will say, well, why find out about something like Huntington's if there's nothing you can do? And one of our writers said, there's a tremendous amount you can do. You can change the way you live your life. You can change lives for other people. So the idea of thinking about intervention in a much more expansive way, not to mention the whole issue of reproductive technologies, which is a really interesting and complicated question. So we ended up with a lot of questions. We also ended up, and I just want to go back to the photograph for a minute of this group, we also ended up changing over the process of working on the volume. And I'm not talking about the process of working on it did something to us as writers. There were really important changes that happened. So for example, the Stenzel twins, Isabel and Annabelle, who are here in the bottom left-hand corner, who were born, they're Japanese American, were born with cystic fibrosis and lived with it their whole lives. Annabelle died just before, they were both had been lung transplant recipients and had gone around the world campaigning for organ donation. Remarkable, remarkable women, and they had co-authored a memoir together. And Annabelle died just before the memoir came out, not of cystic fibrosis or its complications, by the way. She died of actually bladder cancer. There's a whole other story in that story, right? But Emily Rapp, who's holding the little boy who's above the Stenzel twins, her son Ronan had Tay-Sachs disease. People would say to her sometimes, do you have prenatal testing for Tay-Sachs? And she couldn't bear to have to tell people, to have to answer this. In fact, she had, but the standard tests that are done only pick up some kinds of Tay-Sachs and not the kind that Ronan had. And Ronan died at 3 years and a few months while our book was at press. So there were enormous changes for people. And again, when I talk about how this stuff is dynamic and we kind of think about, well, it depends, it's as if it was, the story was unraveling even as we were trying to write it. So how did this experience have anything to do with the interdisciplinary relatedness of what we're now doing in medical humanities? So there's a straightforward answer to that and a more complicated one, and I sort of want to talk about both if I can. The straightforward one is that when you're marketing a book, as some people in this room know who have marketed a book, they ask you, who will want to read this book? And I kept coming across medical humanities, and I remember going to our provost in the spring of 2012, and I said, Boston College should have medical humanities. And he said, well, you should go talk to some people and see who those people might be. And we started reaching out to each other. Actually, we had a series of lunches, and I discovered that there were colleagues of mine in nursing and in history and in theology, where bioethics is happening at Boston College, and in economics, in biology, and in philosophy, and even some other English professors who were really interested in a lot of the things I was interested in. And we met and had lunch, and we talked about what could an interdisciplinary minor look like. So medical humanities is really starting to burgeon around the world, and it's happening in a number of different places. For any of you who do, and I know from looking a little bit at your website that your college is deeply committed to interdisciplinary work, which is wonderful. you probably know it's hard doing interdisciplinary work. You sort of feel that you often end up having to do it one piece at a time. And I've noticed that our students derive a tremendous amount of benefit from their extracurricular activities. This is our new journal that the students have started, because it's in the extracurricular activities, in the clubs and the organizations, that a lot of your interdisciplinary passions really come together. The more complicated reason of why medical humanities for me goes back to BRCA again. Because I found myself thinking, to what discipline does it belong? If I were to say, I work on BRCA and what that's done in my family and what its impact has been, where would I house it? In what department? In biology? And anyone who studies biology and anyone who's read the double helix knows that biology, of course, happens inside of culture and also happens inside of narrative. So this is this picture is of Mary Claire King. She's the one who's sitting on the her lab counter here. Mary Claire King is a personal hero of mine. She's the one who discovered the BRCA gene. And in terms of thinking again about the interdisciplinary and interconnected nature of this issue, this is what she had to, this is what the New York Times said about Mary Claire King. There's never been a scientific career quite like hers. Years ago, her doctoral thesis concluded that humans and chimpanzees were, genetically speaking, 99% the same. Isn't that kind of a humbling thought? A revolutionary thought. Her later work on human cancers resulted in the discovery of the so-called breast cancer gene, BRCA1, which transformed the diagnosis and treatment of the disease. But Mary Claire King's discovery led to some other things as well. For instance, and some of you know a little bit about this, law and bioethics. Here are some other disciplines into which BRCA seems to need to get housed. Because after Mary Claire King had discovered the BRCA gene, Myriad Genetics got a patent on it. And I'm going to show you, let me just show you the timeline for this. You can see here, after the Mary Claire King discovers BRCA, you can see the patents that get given to Myriad in the late 1990s. One of the things that is striking to me about this timeline, now, by the way, we're in a different discipline. We have to think about law and history when we think about BRCA. One of the things that's really striking is you're going to notice that between the time of the patent approval for BRCA and the time in 2013 when the Supreme Court overturned this, there's a lot of years, right? And a lot of women were impacted. So this is what Mary Claire King had to say about this when she was asked about Myriad's holding these patents by the New York Times. I was enormously relieved when BRCA1 was cloned. It meant we could get on with understanding how mutations in it led to breast cancer. But over the next months, the patent issue became a real bear. Myriad demanded exclusive use of BRCA1. Previous genetic patents had been licensed non-exclusively and hadn't made a ripple in how genes were used in research or diagnostics. But Myriad's test cost more than $3,000, and by the way, in those days was rarely paid for by insurance. And there was only one place to obtain it, which meant, by the way, if you got ambiguous results, you couldn't, or if you wanted a second opinion before having your breast removed or your ovaries removed, couldn't get it. Myriad's test, for many women, it was not covered by insurance. It was too high to manage out of pocket. New York Times asked Mary Claire King if she ever got a cease and desist from Myriad, and she said she did. And the irony of this is just kind of hard to fathom. The woman who discovered the gene being told by Myriad that she had to stop researching it, but she didn't. This is Myriad's test. I've been involved for a while with FORCE, and this is just an image of one of the activists who was involved in fighting to get the patents overturned. Though the patents were overturned after the 2013 case, there continue to be big questions, and this kind of goes back to the whole idea of intervention and how far you might go. So people in the field of disability bioethics ask the question, what do we decide conditions? If you guys were imagining that you're going to have a list of the things that you should test for in the first trimester, if you think that that's wise, what would be on your list and what wouldn't be? These are really big issues. What's the role of reproductive technologies in seeking to eliminate, and I'm calling it big terms here, genetic alterity. But one way of thinking about this is that it is now possible to, in fertilized embryos, to detect BRCA mutations and deselect the embryos that have the mutation, so that in families like mine, if you decide that you want to have babies that are not impacted by BRCA, you can decide it. But what are the ethics of that? What does that mean? What are we saying about ourselves as a culture if we decide that we're going to deselect? And also, who's the we? Because insurance doesn't pay for that either, and it's really expensive. So it's not only complicated ethically, it's also not available to everybody. So I've been working for the last couple of years on looking at the ways in which BRCA memoirs try to confront some of these issues through writing. And as a literature professor, I'm especially interested in issues of repetition and traumatic return. I'm also interested in hybridity and the way in which a lot of these memoirs kind of bring together different disciplines, journalism in the case of Masha Gessen, or history, as a way of trying to confront these issues. So I want to end by going back to the idea of relatedness and by telling you another family story, if you don't mind. And this is a story in a way about research and in a way about what we haven't found. So when my daughter Sasha was a sophomore in high school, we went to Chicago together. It was her first trip there for her spring break. You can see it's Chicago spring, it's cold. My father, who lives in Detroit, still lives in Detroit, met us there. And I really wanted to show Sasha the apartment that my mother and Sylvia had lived in. And it became more and more important to me to find it. And the more important it was to me to find it, the less certain my father was that he knew which exact building it was. And in fact, he began to be a little uncertain that we were even on the right street. I took this photograph of them in front of the building that he thought was the best possibility of where she grew up. And as I was standing there taking the photograph, it occurred to me that I wanted to call my mother and ask. It would have been so simple. What street? We called each other Melly. It was a nickname we all shared. And she could tell me in a heartbeat, but she wasn't there. And it occurred to me that she's gone, and Sylvia and Pody and Gail, and all we have is the imprecision of trying to get the story right. And in part, I think, that's what compels me to keep looking, because that's what research is, right? It's what we're curious about looking for. Looking for the door, or the building, or the city in which surely she must have left a trace of herself behind. Thank you.